Okay, so last day on Antigone. I want to go back a little to this question of Antigone as woman. It helps, I think, to look at Eurydice. So if you can look at either, it's at the end of the play. It's 1377, and then the second will be 1387, but that's in Green's translation. I didn't look it up, sorry, the other one. Very close to the end, where we get this, last 2 pages, really. The messenger says, "She stood at the altar, and with keen, whetted knife, she suffered her darkening eyes to close. First she cried in agony, recalling the noble fate of Megarius, who died before all this, and then for the fate of this son, Haemon. And in the end, she cursed you for the evil you had done in killing her sons." And then Creon says something, and then the messenger responds, "You were indeed accused by her that is dead of Haemon's and of Megarius's death." Now, it turns out that Megarius is a son of Creon and Eurydice. There was an oracle that in order to save Thebes from Polynices and the Argives from their attack, one of the family of the original Spartoi, the seeds who grew from the ground, had to die. And Creon chooses his own son, Megarius, to fulfill that oracle. So what Eurydice objects to is doing everything for the sake of the city, being willing to sacrifice everything for the polis. Just occurred to me that Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus is about that too. It's a funny play, Titus Andronicus, because it's the one that all the people who otherwise love Shakespeare condescend to. My view is that on his worst day, Shakespeare is twice as good as anybody else. So even if it were a terrible play, you should take it seriously. So it turns out that they object to 2 things. On the one hand, it's incredibly violent. And on the other hand, it is incredibly sort of scholarly. It's constant references to various other poems and things like that. Not explicit, it doesn't have footnotes, but in order to understand it, you have to know that he's quoting, that he's alluding to Ovid or any number of other people. So it turns out that with all really fine poets, when they do weird things like that and put those 2 things together, the clue to what the play is about is figuring out what poetry and violence have to do with one another. I'm not going to give you the answer to that question. I know it, but I'm not going to give it to you. But in any case, in Titus, the title character, Titus Andronicus, has given up something like 14 of his children in war to support Rome. And there's something very similar here. For Creon, Thebes is in a way his family, and it supersedes the other family, and Eurydice hates him for it. So she prefers her son to Thebes, reminds us of Clytemnestra. Or you could say Eurydice is like Antigone in her attachment to her own. But it's interesting that Eurydice doesn't take any action other than suicide. She kills herself out of grief. Antigone, on the other hand, actively disobeys. And therefore, in order actively to disobey, she has to not just kill herself out of despair, but she has to justify what she's doing. She has to make a principle out of her attachment to her own. You could say Eurydice feels it and shows that love of family consists in the love of particular people, Megarias, Haemon. But Antigone sees Ismene as sister as such, and Polynices and Antiochles both as brother as such. So her love is not so much of particular people as, in a way, of the idea of being connected to particular people. So it's not because she's mourning Polynices that she buries him, it's because she's following the rule, always bury brothers. In fact, then, her behavior is much more like the behavior of Creon. It's much more like that fraternité of patriotism than it is love of family. So you put it this way, patriotism is, in a way, the idea of affection for your fellow citizens and for your homeland without necessarily any particular attachment to any particular one of them singly. So Antigone has made a principle out of the ineffable. And the result is, not surprisingly, at odds with itself. It's a little like what happens in the 20th century in very different places. So if you're doing it on the continent, you could say it comes through Heidegger and it ends up most startlingly and, in a way, in the lesser form, in Heidegger's most famous student is Hans-Georg Gadamer, who writes a book, Truth and Method, in which, in a way, he advocates the primacy of the practical over the theoretical. But you see what a strange thing it is to do that? A theory of the primacy of the practical. Or on the other side of the English Channel, not originally, but in terms of his intellectual influences, the philosopher Wittgenstein, who announces in the Philosophical Investigations that the meaning of a word is its use, and that somehow it's to be found in ordinary language. Ordinary language is all right, it doesn't have to be fiddled with, and so on and so forth. But if that were really simply true, you wouldn't have to say it. Ordinary language be all right, and it would go on and do its stuff. But the articulating in that way is a theoretical response to a practical problem. So whenever anybody announces to you an elaborate and usually much more complicated, say, than Plato, who seems to advocate the philosophical life in a theoretical way, whether that's true or not, but he doesn't do it with highfalutin theory. When anybody uses the language, the elaborate language of theory, so much so that you're not even sure that you understand what they're saying, to advocate the primacy of practical things, it's really time to reach for your wallet and make sure it's still there. Because there's something funny about that, isn't there? That to use the elaborate, almost unintelligible language of theory to tell you that theory is not adequate and that you have to make an appeal to the practical. Doesn't mean it's false, by the way. It does mean that it's something you need to think through. End digression. I want to look briefly at two things today. There's a change that happens in Antigone. She begins to fear death and not welcome it, and she begins to talk about marriage and motherhood. So the question is why that happens and what it means. And then we get another appearance of Tiresias, and we need to know why we need him in the play. What's he doing? Okay, so marriage, where does it come up? If you look at first at line 813, 873, and you can make up wherever else it is, because apparently these numbers don't mean anything. But let me read to you. That'll help. Okay. You see me, you people of my country, as I set out on my last road of all, looking for the last time on this light of this sun, and never again. I am alive, but Hades, who gives sleep to everyone, is leading me to the shores of Acheron. Though I have known nothing of marriage songs, nor the chant that brings the bride to bed, my husband is to be Acheron, who is the Lord of Death. And then at 878, 929, a little bit later, about a page later in my edition, we get this. No tears for me, no friends, no marriage. Broken-hearted, I am led along the road ready before me. I shall never again be suffered to look on the holy eye of the day, but my fate claims no tears, no friend cries for me. And then 891, 945, a little further down, we get tomb, bridal chamber, prison forever, dug in rock, it is to you I am going. So she begins to refer to what's about to happen to her in the language of marriage. She begins to lament the fact that she hasn't married, that she has no, that she will have no children. But you need to notice that it's all extraordinarily abstract. There's never any mention of Haman or any mention of a betrothal. You compare this, for example, to a far lesser play. Jean Anouilh wrote a play called Antigone, in which Antigone becomes a kind of lovesick teenager. And it's interesting because of what, when you compare it to Sophocles' version, you see that in a way you would have, in a way you would have expected. Ismene talks about the fact that she's betrothed to Haman, and Haman and his father talk about it, to be sure, and Antigone doesn't even mention it. So it's a strange omission, especially when she begins lamenting her lack of marriage. And so right after she mentions marriage for the first time to the chorus, we've read this in another context, lines 820 and 882, the chorus call her autonomous. Okay, what about motherhood? Now, it comes in first when she likens herself to Niobe at 824, 885. We get this. I don't think Niobe is named. But indeed, I have heard of the saddest of deaths, of the Phrygian stranger, daughter of Tantalus, whom the rocky growth subdued. Like clinging ivy, the rains never leave her, the snow never fails as she wastes away. That is how men, male men, it really is Andres there, tell the story. From streaming eyes, her tears wet the crags, most like to her, the god brings me to rest. So she compares herself to Niobe. The story of Niobe is interesting. She's turned into an eternal metaphor for her grief. She dared to compare her children to the gods' children favorably, and they killed her children and made her a rock, constantly dripping water out of it. So she's eternally crying. Now, in a way, comparing Antigone to Niobe then looks ridiculous. Antigone is anti-birth. She has no children. She in a way, doesn't want any children, but she likens herself to the eternal picture of the mother who's lost her children. And as we saw, that is, in a way, Antigone. The eternal character of it, her autonomy really consists in being nothing but the law which enjoins love of one's family, love of one's own. She is as unchanging, as steady as a stone. But question, why does that steadiness in Antigone necessarily show itself as burial? Now, Antigone is love of one's own, love of one's family. But there is a contradiction in the law that she represents. Look at lines 856, and the other one is 913, where we get this long passage. You have touched the most painful of my cares, the pity for my father, ever reawakened, and the fate of all of our race, the famous Labdakids, the doomed self-destruction of my mother's bed when she slept with her own son, my father. What parents I was born of, God help me. To them I am going to share their home, the curse on me too, and unmarried. Brother, it was a luckless marriage you made, and dying killed my life. She's clearly talking to Oedipus. And then the chorus, there is a certain reverence for piety for him, but for him in authority, he cannot see that authority defied. It is your own self-willed temper that has destroyed you. No tears for me, no friends, no marriage, broken-hearted I am led along the road ready before me, and so on. We read that part already. So brother means Oedipus. Oedipus incest is given as the reason why Antigone dies unwed. We saw last time that that makes a kind of sense if you ask the question, whom could she really marry? Polynices and Eteocles are both dead, and even if they were alive, marrying within the family is to destroy the family. So what then does it mean for her to mourn Polynices? She can't wish that he is alive. She can't, as her remarks at 962 and 906 indicate, this is the part that the German poet Goethe wanted to remove. Yet those who think rightly will think I did right in honoring you. Had I been a mother of children and my husband been dead and rotten, I would not have taken this weary task upon me against the will of the city. What law backs me when I say this? I will tell you. If my husband were dead, I might have had another, and a child from another man if I lost this one. Goethe wanted to take that out because he thought it was monstrous. It's interesting, though, the original comes from Book 3 of Herodotus, a version of it, but Sophocles' way of putting it is interesting. She says, if my husband were dead, I might have had another, and a child from another man if I lost this one. On the one hand, it just means what it means. It means that you can get another husband, you can't get another brother. But the curious thing is that she says, if my husband were dead, I might have had another. But presumably, if my child were dead, I could have had another child from another man. Why does it have to be another man? Why can't she have another child from the same man? If my husband dies, I can have another. If my child dies, I can have another child from another man. It only makes sense if it turns out that her dead husband is her child, right? It's crazy, but in a way, her language betrays her and shows that the only condition that makes sense of this strange remark is that one. So to wish her parents alive, you could say, she can't wish for her brother to be alive. She can't wish for her parents to be alive in order to be able to generate another brother for her, because that's to wish for another incestuous birth. Both of the alternatives point to incest. So it turns out that, to sort of wend our way back to this issue, her burial of Polynices is her expression of love for Polynices. She can't wish to have a brother, on the one hand, so burial is a kind of substitute. To bury Polynices means to put him in Hades, and Hades, this place, the name of which really means literally invisible, it's a place that's not a place, is a place where there is no generation. And so burial is a way of being with Polynices without being with Polynices understood sexually. So sunousia means to be with, but also means to be with in the sexual sense. So it is important then that Antigone's introduction of the possibility of being a mother, it's really introduced only as a sort of counterfactual in order to show that it's really not possible for her. She imagines it for no reason other than to repudiate it in advance. So what have we got? Antigone's situation seems to be this. She has to bury her own because she cannot be with her own. So the rites for the dead are her way of enacting her devotion to her own in all of its absoluteness, in a way that is, ironically, impossible as long as they are real life people. So the remarkable thing is the totality of her devotion to her dead brother and her casual dismissal of her live sister. But precisely this compels her to return to Polynices' corpse. She would presumably do it over and over again because it doesn't really satisfy her. That she has to do it a second time means that it points to the, in principle, endless character of the ritual. So start over. Antigone's pain at being apart from her family, apart from her own, points to a pain at not being whole, not being autonomous. The law of burial in some way gives a form to that pain, a way of showing one's pure devotion to one's own, to what it is that makes family relations different from relations that are chosen, and therefore relations that have a reason for being. The interesting thing about family relations is, of course, that they simply are. But it gives her a way that doesn't lead to incest, or you could say ultimately to the destruction of one's own by confusing what you were born into with what you choose. So it's a little bit, I mean, you put it in this way. She's in a situation that's, in its way, very much like what happens when politically, for example, one appeals to a tradition and says, we do this, we can't let this tradition, be undermined. And that happens all the time, on the one hand, and on the other hand, what's interesting is that the appeal to the tradition happens precisely only when it's no longer traditional. I mean, if it were really a tradition, you wouldn't have to justify it in this way. It's like it's like the Sarah Lawrence nursery school teacher with the block that was thrown across the room, and her response was, we don't do that here. You only say we don't do that here when we do that here, because otherwise there's no reason to say we don't do that here. So the irony about all appeals to tradition is that they involve an admission that the tradition isn't actually operating as you claim it does operate. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to use it as a justification. Now, the problem, of course, with with taking the law of burial seriously or literally is that it would be an inducement to suicide. You can be with your own purely only in some place like Hades. Now, this inducement becomes visible in the incestuous family, where the impossibility of being together, other than in the antigenerational climate of Hades, is most clear. So, you need something like Hades to make sense of a ritual of burial, which in turn makes it possible to do something that expresses love of one's own in a pure way. But the problem is it can't be taken literally, or it destroys the possibility of the ritual. Or you could say, built into the burial law in practice is the necessity that it be understood to be for form's sake. Hosiu heneka, which means this wonderful Greek expression, which I probably have misspelled. You don't realize that, that if you're a bad speller in English, you'll also be a bad speller in Greek and in any other language you try to learn. So it means literally for the sake of the holy. But idiomatically, it doesn't mean that. It means for form's sake, something you do for form's sake. So it's a beautiful example of what it is, because it tells you that the holy can't be what it is if it's taken literally. That this is finally what Antigone is about, I think becomes clear in the Tiresias section, which I'm going to turn to in a minute. Can't work that way because this play was written, like 30 years before the other play. So it can't be an actual reference in this play to the Oedipus, because the Oedipus play wasn't yet written. It might work the other way. It might be the case that Sophocles. So it's funny because we read it, and we have to read it the way we read the Oresteia, as though it's a trilogy, because the events seem to follow one upon the other. But they were actually belonged to different trilogies when they were presented first at the festival. So it's fair, I think, to say that there is a parallel between the two events, and that Sophocles wrote both plays suggests that it'd be interesting to think about the fact that you have two tragedies where two men who are so, bullheaded in a way, end up seeming to submit themselves to the rule of others, although as we saw in the Oedipus Tyrannos, it's actually not true of Oedipus. Is it true here? You want to take one step back and see the first and crucial thing is that he begins as the absolute defender of the political order. She begins as the absolute defender of the family. He ends by being punished with the death of his entire family. So he's forced to realize in some way that his defense of the city as meaning everything wasn't accurate. He's forced to acknowledge in a way the importance of the family at the end. The funny thing about Antigone is that it doesn't seem to be the case. We get a sort of, she's more like her father. There's a feint at the end where her language is the language of, oh, how terrible, I'll die unwed and I will die without children. But then when you examine what she actually says about it, her account has the same abstract character that it had throughout. If Eurydice had died that way and had been, betrothed to someone, she would have said, now I'll never marry X, right? So Antigone might have said, oh, I won't marry Haemon, right? But that's not even on her mind. It's only the abstract question of marriage that's on her mind, and the abstract question of children as well. And that turns out to, the reason for that turns out to be that that in a way is perfectly consistent with her celebration of, it's really perfectly consistent with the first line. O common head of my very own sister is meaning that it's the relation of sister that is important to her and not the actually existent sister. So it's love of one's own, not love of my own. But one's own really shows up in real life as my own. It doesn't show up as the abstract principle, love of one's own. It shows up as, the fact that I feel responsible for this child or for this parent or whatever. It doesn't, so it's something that happens, interestingly enough, there's also a biblical equivalent to it, It's when you have a message from God that tells you, honor thy father and mother, when it becomes a principle enforced by God that you owe honor to the father and the mother, that's one step beyond the kind of familial attachment that love of one's own is supposed to be describing. Where naturally you would honor your father, honor your mother. That's what it means to have a father. That's what it means to have a mother. You have to be told to do it. Means it's sort of the equivalent of, we don't do that here, which is a sign that we do. I don't know if I've even come close to addressing your question, but it'll have to do for now. Let's do Tiresias. It looks at first as though Tiresias is supporting Antigone. He never, but on the other hand, he never indicates that it's a crime to kill her. He only objects to the way in which she's killed. He never bases his argument for burial on kinship. According to Tiresias, she would have been obliged to bury her child. So Antigone's argument is in terms of her own. Tiresias seems much more universal. Unrelated point, but important somehow. If you look at 997, 1050, he tells Creon, you're on the razor's edge. You're about to do something. You're just about you'll be unsavable. So it looks as though if Creon had given in when he speaks after Tiresias the first time at 1033, 1092, he would have been okay. Tiresias comes in and says, you're just on the verge of falling into this trap, and Creon's next lines, he doesn't give in. It looks as though it should be the case if somebody's warning you. This is your last warning, Tiresias. And then it turns out I'm sorry, this is your last warning, Creon. And then the next time Creon speaks, he ought to be able to say, okay, I take your point. But, between 70 and 80 lines later, at line 1105, 1178, it's already too late. So we get this at 1150 in green. The delay will not be long before the cries of mountains of mourning in your house of men and women. Although the chorus continue to act as though that isn't the case. They say, some 20 lines later, what must I do then? Tell me, I shall agree. The girl, one, now go and bring her up from her cave, and for the exposed dead man, give him his burial. So the question is, to what extent Creon ever really had a chance, and what precisely that chance was. We'll come back to that. Tiresias' first speech divides in two. Line 1053 to 1071, or 998 through 1014. Signs of Tiresias' art of prophecy. And then lines 1073 through 1091, or 1016 to 1032, his conclusions. But in the middle, there's a dividing line, either 1015 or 1072, that reads this way. He says, this is the city's sickness, and your plans are the cause of it. Or literally, these things of your mind make the city sick. Now, the first part concerned with Tiresias' art of prophecy is very precise and very specific. The second part, the part concerned with his conclusions, is rather general. The altars of the town are all choked, but he doesn't say anything about what that means or how it's shown up or what. Also noticeable is that Tiresias seems to indicate that Creon has made an error and all he needs to do is correct it. So it's not claiming that what Creon has done is simply and finally unholy. So you could say, just as there are general and specific parts of his speech, there are in a way two parts of his argument. On the one hand, Tiresias says, do what I say because the city needs my art, and the lines to the gods are all clogged up because of what you have done. So clean up your act and set things straight, and then I'll be able to do my job. So he's appealing to Creon as a citizen of Thebes. And then the second part of his argument is, do what I say because you have done something simply universally unholy. So Tiresias argues in a double way, just as when he comes in, he introduces himself in a double way. He says, lines 1042 or 988, "My lords of Thebes, we have come here together, one pair of eyes serving us both. For the blind, such must be the way of going, by a guide's leading." So he has a servant who's with him. So on the one hand, he argues with Creon and therefore gives him a reason for behaving as he wants him to behave. That's Denos clever or canny. And on the other hand, he announces what is absolutely holy and doesn't allow for any discussion or justification whatsoever, and that's Denos too, the uncanny. This doubleness is repeated when his overall argument in his first speech doesn't work, and he has to replace it in the second speech with a threat. So the doubleness is Tiresias' attempt to recombine Creon and Antigone, or you could say to acknowledge that they need to be combined. Creon is simply the utilitarian, and Antigone is simply the holy. But the holy, in its raw state, is too savage for political life. It undermines political life with the absoluteness of its demands. You remember at line 47 in one of our editions, 471 and then 515, the chorus called Antigone savage, which can also mean raw. Savage child of a savage father. Homon ex homo. That's directly after she appeals to Zeus's unwritten law. Now, whereas Antigone's appeal to the divine is raw or savage, Tiresias is literally cooked. He talks about sacrifice in that way. So the raw has undergone a transformation. It's been made civil. You could say he's made the transition from Hosiouheneka, for the sake of the holy, to Hosiouheneka, meaning for form's sake. And this, of course, I mentioned this last time, has to do with the greatest shock in the play. After all the talk about burial, Creon and his servants decide to burn Polynices' corpse. Cremation is not mentioned anywhere in this play. It's certainly compatible with the law. It's a rite, a funeral rite performed for the dead. But it's not so clearly compatible with Antigone's devotion to the law. Burial, you could say, allows Antigone's repeated slurring of the difference between the grave and Hades. And that really points as well, although we haven't much talked about it, to her slurring the difference between the body and the soul. Cremation really forces the issue. Antigone cannot think of herself as lying with Polynices in a literal sense if his corpse has been burned up and put in an urn. So the cremation requires that you understand the holy metaphorically. Cremation prevents taking the holy, the accounts of Hades raw. So Antigone threatens the link between the holy and civility, and Tiresias tries to restore it through burnt offerings. Now, what this means is shown through the doubleness, the ambiguity of his appeal. You could say the issue of the play in a way is this. The whole play is about the necessity to keep together the two meanings of the word deinos. It's about the fact that hosiouheneka can only mean for the sake of the holy if it has come to mean something like for form's sake. So Antigone's demand for the same kind of absoluteness of knowledge on the level of the transpolitical as we experience on the level of the political destroys the effectiveness of the transpolitical, which is its effectiveness is to cause us to call into question what we're ordinarily certain of. So Creon's too sure of himself, but in understanding the divine the way she does, Antigone too is too sure of herself. So that's what it means, I think, to say that she simply reproduces the problem of Creon, but she does it on a higher level. There's much more we could do on this play, but I'm kind of finished. We're early for a change, so I'm not sure I can even make you late by, yes, or.
I don't understand for the sake of the form. Could you explain that more?
For the sake of the
Form.
So, hosiouheneka. For form's sake means something like ritual. It looks as though ritual is derivative. We'll notice when we get to the Iphigenia among the Taurians that it's all about human sacrifice. And human sacrifice can mean actually taking a body and slitting the throat and burning it up on a funeral pyre. Or by the end of the play, we're given a situation where we get a description of someone coming to the altar and having a drop of blood. The knife is applied and a drop of blood is taken, and you have a ritual sacrifice. So the first is hosiouheneka taken raw. It's just, it is what it is. It would be as though if you're Catholic and you went to I've lost the word, communion, you really did, there are differences, but there's a sense in which you always know that even if there's a transformation of the wafer to the body of Christ and the wine to the blood, that it's not, because you're experiencing it, that it's not quite eating human flesh and eating and drinking blood. So it's important, that distinction between whether there's really a transformation or not, but it's still, there's a way in which if you were actually consuming human flesh and drinking blood, that would be too raw. That would be hosiouheneka for the sake of the holy, taken so literally that in fact you would lose the sense that it stood for something. Whereas when it's put at a distance and it's thought to be for form's sake, by identifying it as a ritual, you are forced to think about what it stands for. Now, the danger is, of course, that when something becomes for form's sake, it even means that for us. When we say, oh, that's just for form's sake, we mean that it doesn't mean anything. That, it's like, back in the days when I was your age and younger, if you were Catholic, you couldn't eat meat on Fridays. And we used to go out after basketball games, and my best friend, we'd go to a diner, and it would be like, the basketball game was over at 10 o'clock or so. So we'd be out, and actually, anyway, you don't need to know the rest of it. And he'd want a hamburger, and so he'd turn his watch ahead, right? So it was midnight, and it was okay to eat because it was so, and he would sort of laugh about it on the one hand, but he was serious about it on the other hand. So that was a weird recognition of the fact that the injunction against consuming meat on Friday was a ritual, and rituals don't have to be followed to the letter. They're not perfect as long as you're acknowledging them. On the one hand, on the other hand, if you turn that the time back too far, it ceases to mean anything. It ceases to mean anything at all. So you're on a sort of continuum where on the one end you have a kind of absolute, absolutely literal interpretation. It's not even interpretation. You do the things that you do, and on the other hand, it becomes so formulaic and so ritualized that it's lost any sense of meaning anything. It's just you're going through the motions. That's what for form's sake means. But it turns out that relation between Hosea Heneka for the sake of the holy and Hosea Heneka for form's sake, they have to be present. It can't be what it is unless they're both present. So you could say burial and cremation are both Hosea Heneka. They're both rites. In this play, we're shown that one of them allows, under certain circumstances, it's not to say cremation is better than, you could say this, if you lived in a time and a place where in order to understand the meaning of the ritual, you had to take its literal meaning more seriously, then maybe burial would be preferable. But if you lived in a time and a place where you ran the risk of taking the meaning too literally, then maybe cremation would be preferable and get you closer to what you were supposed to see. But the interesting thing is that it's utterly metaphorical character would stop being a metaphor because it wouldn't mean anything. And its utterly literal character would mean that it didn't mean anything because it wasn't pointing to anything. It was just eating flesh. When I started, I said you have to understand the change. The change is that anti-birth Antigone is utterly unconcerned with, not only utterly unconcerned with, but given the way I interpreted her behavior at the beginning, doesn't care about marriage and doesn't care. She can't marry because the only person she could marry is dead. And she doesn't care about children because that's the generational family. And then it turns out that when you get to the end, she starts talking a lot about marriage and motherhood. And then your question legitimately is, okay. And then my point was, yeah, but see, that's interestingly abstract. She doesn't really care about real kids. She doesn't really care about real marriage. It's a principle. So I think that fits rather nicely with what you just said, that insofar as anti-birth is now thinking about motherhood and childbearing as such, it is a kind of acknowledgement of the fact that her attachment to her own, the way she has construed it from the beginning, isn't sufficient. It needs more. And if it needs more, then it's a sign of her own need, which is a sign of a lack of autonomy. So I think that that's an interesting way to begin to think it through. That's a good question too. I think it's not an accident this question came after that question, because you could say the hard part is And Aristotle, even if he didn't, even if it weren't obvious, he points it out several times in Poetics. So you know when the recognition is supposed to take place in the Oedipus. But you wouldn't have trouble taking Aristotle's definition, even if he hadn't used it as his prime example, and saying, oh, well, when the crisis really starts is when the messenger comes from Corinth. So you would know that, right? Whereas if you're in Antigone, it's, I think, much harder to locate where it occurs. It's easier if it were the tragedy of Creon, it would be quite easy. I mean, it is true that what Aristotle means about recognition, which he doesn't point to very often, but it's clear that the recognition that goes on in the audience is not necessarily, or maybe even can't be, the same as the recognition that goes on in the character. So for him, the recognition seen in the Oedipus is in a way the classic version. And it turns out that Oedipus doesn't really come to know himself. I mean, he recognizes something, but as we saw, he repeats a very similar error at the end of the play. So if I were, the reason I said it followed rather nicely after the previous question is that in a way you could say, if you're looking for Antigone's recognition, if it exists, it looks as though it has to be this acknowledgement of marriage and childbearing. But it would, in a way, follow the same pattern as Oedipus's recognition, because it would be a sort of false recognition, because it's a recognition in principle, whereas what those things are meant to point to is something that is, in a way, irreducibly particular. That's what I meant by starting by saying that she turns the ineffable into a principle. I can't blame her for that. In a way, it's her greatness that she tries to do that. But what we're meant to see is how problematic that is, however extraordinary the temptation to do it. And, in a way, let's be honest about it, it's one thing to turn it into a principle and act it out in that way, but isn't that what we've been trying to do all semester, to talk about it, to figure out the weird way in which tragedy succeeds in talking about what you're not supposed to be able to talk about, and shows you how important it is that you're not supposed to be able to talk about it, and simultaneously shows you that if you try to talk about it in a certain way, you're getting into big trouble. And yet that's what tragedy does all the time. So the question that ought to be haunting you is, how is Sophocles different from Oedipus? That's the biggest question and it's clear that Sophocles thinks he's different from Oedipus. He thinks in some way it's possible for him to talk about the ineffable in a way that doesn't get him into the trouble that Antigone gets into, and that has something to do with the power of poetry, and has something to do with the strange doubleness of Denos, but also the strange doubleness of Hosiohenica that can, in fact, that it looks as though they're absolutely separable and that the one precludes the other, but in fact, the one is really impossible without the other. When I claim that they cross and her position turns into something suspiciously, structurally similar to love of, this thing that pulls the city together, it looks as though that means her Polynices, Ismene, Eteocles, independent of a common source in Oedipus and Jocasta. So it's structurally like the city, but it doesn't actually connect her to anybody else in the city.
It's false recognition.
Yeah. If you're looking for a clue as to where or why it might occur, I wish there were text to justify this, because it's so, but it's still, doesn't Antigone have to ask herself at some point, who's going to bury me? I mean, it's one thing that she dies under the ground, and so it's a sort of a certain version of raw burial. I mean, she's under the dirt, but there's no ritual to it, and there's nobody to do it. I mean, Ismene's not going to do it because she didn't do it for Polynices. Why should she do it for Antigone? And there's nobody left, and she doesn't have any children. That's what children do. Children bury their parents. So Antigone, if you're looking for a reason for her recognition that she's needy, then maybe it has to do with that burial requires people after you to take care of you, and that's what we mean by children. Well, I think that the interesting, and the same thing is true of oracles, right?
Yeah.
That you get an oracle that tells you you're going to sleep with your mother and kill your father, and you say, oh, that can't happen, I better run away. But then if that's true, what does it mean to have an oracle to warn you? So I think the general answer, you'd have to look in specific instances, is that there's a kind of acknowledgement that we are both aware of the fact that we depend on, you could say, divine knowledge or something beyond what we get from ordinary life. And at the same time, we're aware that it's at some level not, we can never be sure, and it's not available to us. Oracles, in every instance, I think, in Greek literature that I know, the famous one is, I forget the details, but I think it's the Lydian king, whose name escapes me at the moment, in Herodotus, who goes to the oracle to determine whether he should go to war with the Persians. And the oracle says, a great battle will be fought and won tomorrow. And so he says, great. And he goes and fights the battle, and a great battle is fought and won. He just didn't win it. The Persians won it. And he realizes that that in a way it was true, but it's always ambiguous. You don't know what it means. So you're tempted by it because you need it on the one hand, and yet because it's necessarily of a sort that is very different from anything that you get in an ordinary earthly way, it comes it comes sort of miraculously, and so you're never sure of its status, of what exactly it means. And the seers are versions of that. You want them, and yet you mistrust them because they don't correspond to anything. You put it in this way. You need them not to correspond to anything else in your life. They have to be so far beyond everything else that they are, in a way, because everything else is, you'd look at the person and you'd figure out whether you could believe them, whether they've been good in the past, whether you doubt them, how smart they are, so on and so on. But you can't do that with oracles. It has to be a voice from out of nowhere that you trust because it's so different from everything else. And on the other hand, it's so different from everything else. How can you trust that? So it is precisely the character of knowledge that we think of as coming from the divine, that it is necessarily what we want on the one hand and too good to be true on the other hand. And so you both believe them and don't. And seers, and in Greek tragedy, it's almost always Tiresias. Tiresias is precisely that, status, and it's true of all the oracles as well. You remember that when she performed it for the second time, we had the question about the dust and the damp body. So we, of course, and the guards take it that she's coming back to rebury him. And that makes perfect sense looked at from a certain point of view, but when we ask the simple-minded question, how did she even know he was unburied? We were in a situation where we might have responded, well, maybe she didn't know that he was unburied, but what she had tried to do in order to feel as though she had fulfilled her obligation didn't do the job, because there's something, she wanted it to be real, and it can only be metaphorical. But it's like those things that you say, Hosea Heneke, for form's sake, at funerals, when you are attempting to give people some solace for the loss of someone they love. And you do it, and even if you do it well, as some people do it quite wonderfully, it doesn't sound, I mean, you always leave saying, oh, I wish I had said the right thing. And what that means, of course, is there's no right thing to say. I mean, you can't say the thing that will actually make the person feel better. The best you can do is acknowledge that you know that how awful they feel. But what you're supposed to be doing is sort of giving them something to hold on to, and you end up uttering these banalities that you're sort of embarrassed to have used, but you don't have, what else are you going to say? There's nothing that you can say. Somehow that's what's saturating Antigone's need to fulfill her obligation to her own in a way that's perfectly satisfactory. And I think that's what I meant by saying it's not enough, and she'd have to go back and do it over and over again, and it would never satisfy her. Now that's what I meant. That's not necessarily what the play means. I mean, you probably don't realize it, but there might be a difference between what I mean and what it's hard play. They're all hard plays. But just remember Titus Andronicus, right? That they're all, even the ones that are supposed to be. One of the critics, I think it might even be I think it might be Eliot, who criticizes Titus for its, I remember this phrase, thumpingly regular iambic pentameter. That's what because of the extraordinarily regular character of the verse in Shakespeare's Titus. But then when it turns out to be about poetry and about what poetry does and the manner in which poetry can induce a kind of violence, you realize, oh, well, maybe the thumpingly regular iambic pentameter was part of the plan. So it's important to always realize, it's funny, it looks like it's incredibly humble to come to these plays and always assume that they're right and you're wrong, and that if you don't get it, it's because it's your problem, it's not their problem. It's not really humility, it's just absolute selfishness, because they get so much more interesting when you do it that way than when you're willing to say, oh, well, early play by Shakespeare, didn't quite know what he was doing yet, let's move on to X. And you just miss so much that way. It's just really tragic. Creon gets to the end of the play, and he's been the perfect citizen, willing to give up both of his sons, well, in the name of. So he's been the absolutely perfect citizen, and his wife commits suicide, and his other son is dead, and he feels lousy because his son is dead, his wife is dead, and his other son is dead. And he doesn't articulate it in terms of a principle at all. He just feels like crap. Right? So he, in a way, is really recognizing the claim of the family of one's own, precisely because he doesn't articulate it as a principle. He just experiences it. Whereas Antigone realizes that she has narrowed the family so that her way of understanding the family destroys the family. And so she in some way realizes that she has to include marriage, somehow has to include marriage and childbirth. But once again, she does it in such an utterly abstract way that it's not real marriage and it's not real childbirth. And so there's a way in which she's grander because she represents this principle to the end, but in a way that makes her more of a tragic figure than Creon, because you could say he's learned his lesson, and he'll be miserable for the rest of his life. He's learned his lesson, and that's okay because we weren't all that interested in him anyway. Antigone, we are interested in, and we watch her, quote, learn her lesson, and then we discover, no, just like her father, in learning her lesson in that way, she repeats the same problem over again and is meant to pull us to see how intractable that problem is, that it can't be solved in the way Antigone tries to solve it. Well, yes and no, but Tiresias is not a representative of the city. Tiresias is a representative of the divine, and to acknowledge the divine in that way is to admit that the city isn't self-sufficient. And his tacit position from the beginning was that the city is enough. So even to call Tiresias in is in a way, he doesn't do it on his own. He's urged to do it, and he reluctantly does it. And then it turns out that he's unconvinced that this is necessary. He's finally convinced and is willing to go do it for the sake of the city. Still doesn't want to do it, obviously. But then, in this interesting turnabout, does it in such a way, I don't think self-consciously, but for him, he's got two things to do. The chorus say, dig up, get the girl, bury the corpse. He reads that as bury the corpse, get the girl, not because he wants Antigone to die, but because he understands the importance of getting the corpse not even under the ground, and gives it this elaborate funeral, this ritualized funeral, which takes much longer than actually just putting him in a hole. So we're witnessing Creon do everything he does, really, for the sake of the city. But given his understanding of what that means, it ends up leading to the death of Antigone anyway. And Antigone, you're right. I mean, we see her as the defender of the family. We then have to look at every instance in which she appears not to defend the family or not to follow the principle of love of one's own. And so the argument between her and Ismene at the beginning is the burial of Polynices. She understands that as the pure expression of love of one's own. Ismene is the one who mentions Haemon, who stands for the generational family, not Antigone's version of the family, not the eternal family, and who refuses to engage in this activity. And Antigone essentially disowns her, kicks her out of the family for not being an adequate member of the family. Now that is inconsistent with the notion that your own is your own because you're born into that relation and you don't choose it on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's consistent for Antigone because having articulated that as a principle, someone who doesn't believe in the principle looks as though that someone can't. So at every point where she seems to diverge from this pure love of the family, it points to a tension within the notion of love of the family. So it's not that she believes something perfectly coherent and then is weak and sometimes gives in to her anger and says, out of here, Ismene. It's that when she commits these acts, they're presented to us in this way as ways of exposing the fundamental contradiction within her position, within love of oneself. So yes, she's disloyal to Ismene. And why is she disloyal to Ismene? Because of her love of the family. Because Antigone's love is pure, and Ismene's isn't. Ismene's is sensible. I mean, Ismene behaves the way any of us would behave. And, I can't do the whole distance, but I won't tell on you, and so on and so forth. That doesn't cut any ice with Antigone. Antigone is I mean, she's an unchanging principle. And she doesn't, Ismene doesn't count after she does that. It's not a question of whether she has decent motives or whether she could sympathize, it doesn't matter. Antigone is too pure for that. I think that's to make it too easy. That's to make it seem as though they have these ideas and they don't realize that they're contradictory. And if they were a little smarter, they'd see that they were contradictory and that they wouldn't have to fall into the trap they fall into. So that's tragedy understood as people making mistakes that they could well have avoided. And that's Ismene. Ismene is a very sensible person who is, if you were choosing a life to live, in fact, most of us would choose the way Ismene chooses. But the thing that makes Antigone so grand is that she focuses in on something that's very much a part of us, and which we all think to be a good thing about us. And she celebrates it completely. And then it turns out that her complete celebration of it, which is the very reason we admire her, leads to this tragic consequence. And so I think we need to be struck by two things, that it's what you call her philosophy is underneath it all, there's something deeply problematic about it, but we also have to, but while we would prefer to be Ismene on the one hand, we don't admire her more than we admire Antigone. There's something magnificent about Antigone. And we have to explain that to ourselves. While on the one hand, we think she's more magnificent, on the other hand, Ismene is probably the way most of us would go most of the time. And it has something to do with her longing for a kind of perfection understood in certain terms, and her willingness to sacrifice for it and to push it all the way. There's something really impressive about that. And then, of course, we're also supposed to see that when you push these things that we all find impressive are dangerous in a way that Ismene's life will never be dangerous. I'm not sure exactly where that leaves us, but I think it leaves us. What time is it? Are we late again? Did I do it? Did I make us late even though we finished a half an hour early? Sorry, let's quit.